July 4th, 1187. On the dry, unforgiving ground near Hattin, a group of prisoners was pulled out from the rest. They wore white mantles, marked with a red cross. They were the Knights Templar, a military order of monks and warriors who had sworn their lives to the defense of the Holy Land. One by one, they were executed on the battlefield, not during the fighting, but after the battle was already over. They had lost. They had been captured. They no longer had weapons in their hands. And that is what makes this moment so important, because the other prisoners were not treated the same way. Many of the Latin nobles, knights, and soldiers still had value. They could be ransomed. They could be exchanged. They could be used in political negotiations. So Saladin, the great Muslim ruler, kept many of them alive. But for the Templars, he gave a different order: separate them from the rest and execute them all. Why would Saladin kill men who had already been defeated? Why, after the battle was finished, did these captured knights still seem too dangerous to leave alive? 10 years earlier, the Templars had been at Montgisard, where a much smaller army from Jerusalem had smashed Saladin's forces and stopped what looked like an open road toward the Holy City. Saladin lost that battle, and it took him almost a decade to return in full strength. But the executions at Hattin were not simply revenge for Montgisard. The reason went much deeper than that. What had made this organization so feared that even after its members had lost a battle, been captured, and been disarmed, they still could not be allowed to survive? To answer that, we have to leave Hattin behind and go back almost 90 years to Jerusalem. In 1099, the First Crusade captured Jerusalem. For tens of thousands of men who had marched from Western Europe, this was the end of a sacred journey. They had reached the Holy City. They had fought for the goal they believed God had placed before them. And for many of them, the crusade was over. So after the victory, most of the crusaders went home. But taking Jerusalem was not the same as holding it. For the small number of Latins who stayed behind, Jerusalem was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a burden that would last for generations. The gates needed guards. The walls needed patrols. And the roads linking the coast to the interior had to remain open, because food, messages, pilgrims, and reinforcements all had to pass through those roads before they could reach Jerusalem. From 1099 onward, Jerusalem was no longer just the destination of a crusading army. It became the capital of a Latin kingdom in the heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Kingdom of Jerusalem. And from the very beginning, this young kingdom had one enormous problem. It did not have enough people. The Latin population that remained was small, spread thin across a land far larger than it could realistically control. Jerusalem sat at the center of this world, but around it was a web of cities, castles, way stations, water sources, ports, and roads. All of them mattered, because losing one road could mean losing a supply line, and if the supply lines failed, Jerusalem could be isolated in the middle of hostile territory. If pilgrims could not reach Jerusalem safely, then the victory of 1099 lost much of its meaning. A pilgrim leaving Europe might arrive safely at a coastal port, but the journey from the coast to Jerusalem was another matter entirely. That road did not pass through peaceful country. Some sections were firmly controlled by the Latins, others were barely protected, and some areas were exposed to raiders and bandits who were ready to rob, kidnap, or kill travelers long before they ever saw the walls of Jerusalem. Without protection, a pilgrim could lose everything, and if the situation turned bad enough, they could lose their life before reaching the Holy City at all. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had a king. It had nobles. It had a feudal army. But a feudal army was not built for constant protection. It was called together for a campaign, then it broke apart when the campaign ended. A lord had his own lands to manage. A noble had his own family, property, and political ambitions to protect. But the roads needed guards every day. The castles needed garrisons all year, and pilgrims kept coming. Jerusalem needed something different from a traditional feudal army. It needed a permanent military force. In the early 12th century, that answer appeared in the form of a small group of knights almost nobody knew. The man most closely associated with their beginning was Hugh de Payens, a knight from Champagne in northern France. He and a small group of companions took on a mission that few others were willing to accept. They would protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads leading to Jerusalem. They had little money, no great power base in Europe, no famous reputation, and only one mission: keep pilgrims alive long enough to reach the Holy Land. Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem, gave them quarters near the Temple Mount, one of the holiest places in the city, and the site where Latin Christians believed the ancient Temple of Solomon had once stood. From that base came their original name, the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Later, the world would know them by a shorter name, the Knights Templar. From the beginning, their identity was tied to Jerusalem, and their first purpose was simple: protect vulnerable people on a dangerous road. So how did a small group of unknown escorts become one of the most feared military forces of the Crusades? The Templars were shaped by two things: religious vows and military duty in the Holy Land. A Templar knight swore to live simply, remain unmarried, and obey his superiors within the order. He lived inside the community. He ate according to its rules. He slept under its discipline. He prayed on its schedule. And when an order came down from above, he was expected to obey. He did not go to war because he personally wanted to. He went because the order commanded it. His horse, his weapons, his armor, even his white mantle, none of these truly belonged to him. They belonged to the organization. And that structure was exactly what the Kingdom of Jerusalem needed. War in the Holy Land was rarely one great battle and then peace. Most of the time, the work was slower, harder, and less glorious. A Templar might escort a group of pilgrims through a dangerous stretch of road, or hold a mountain pass for months, or sit inside a fortress, waiting, as weeks passed with no major fighting at all. An army from Europe could arrive, fight one campaign, and then return home. The Templars stayed. Their rule kept them inside a stable system, no matter who lived and who died. Their religious vows turned military service into sacred duty, and that created a kind of discipline that most feudal armies simply did not have. An individual knight could fall in battle. A noble could change sides, lose interest, or focus on his own lands and political survival. But the order continued. That was the greatest value the Templars brought to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A permanent presence in a land that was always under threat. And the difference was not only that they stayed, it was also how they fought. A feudal knight might go into battle for personal honor, for his lord, or for the chance of reward. And if the battle went badly, he could still decide to retreat. A Templar entered battle under a very different expectation. He had already sworn that he would not withdraw without permission, no matter how badly outnumbered he was. The rules of the order were strict. Abandoning a position without orders was a grave offense. A Templar could even be expelled from the order for it. And for a man who had sworn his life to that order, expulsion was more than punishment. It was almost a kind of living death. For their enemies, this meant facing a wall of men who were trained not to break, not to scatter, not to retreat simply because the pressure became terrifying.
Steady, brothers!
But discipline and vows were only the foundation. To become a real power, the Templars needed something more. They needed money, fortresses, land, and influence on the ground. So where did all of that come from? The Kingdom of Jerusalem was always short on manpower, and the Templars helped fill that gap with something rare, a permanent force that did not dissolve after every campaign. They escorted pilgrims, They guarded roads, they garrisoned castles, and when the kingdom needed troops, they could take the field. In the Holy Land, a fortress was not just a stone wall. It could guard a road, watch over a water source, block an invasion route, or force an enemy army to stop and conduct a siege instead of pushing deeper into Latin territory. For a kingdom that never had enough soldiers, a chain of strong castles could be more valuable than a large army that only appeared for a few weeks and then disappeared. Over time, the Templars were given control of more and more important positions across the Crusader states, the Latin territories created after the First Crusade. Many of these were not minor outposts. By the 13th century, the scale of their power could be seen in fortresses like Safed, which the Templars rebuilt on a massive scale in northern Galilee. This fortress could hold hundreds of troops. It had double walls, deep defenses, and a commanding position over the route between Damascus and the coast. A fortress like that was not just defensive, it shaped the entire region around it. Any Muslim army moving through that area had to deal with it. They had to stop. They had to besiege it. They had to spend time, men, and supplies before they could move forward. In places like this, the Templars were not just guards. They were garrison troops, road patrols, and heavy cavalry that could be thrown into a campaign when needed. But keeping a fortress alive was expensive. Horses had to be bought, armor had to be repaired, weapons had to be reforged after use. Walls aged every year and had to be maintained. Food had to be moved across dangerous country, sometimes from many miles away. And the Templars could not support all of this with the limited resources of Jerusalem alone. Over decades, they built up soldiers, castles, and an increasingly essential role in keeping the Crusader states from collapsing. But all of it required money. Castles did not feed themselves. Cavalry did not appear out of nowhere. Armor, horses, weapons, food, garrisons, all of it had to be maintained year after year. So where did the money come from when the Holy Land itself was poor in resources? A fortress like Safed could not sustain itself, and the Holy Land could not pay for the entire Templar system on its own. So the order looked west. Across Europe, supporters began donating land, houses, income rights, and property to the Templars. To manage these assets, the order created commanderies, local centers that handled land, revenue, and administration. They appeared across France, England, Iberia, and many other regions of Europe. And from this network came something that very few medieval organizations possessed: a system that could turn Western wealth into military power in the East. A piece of land in France could help fund a castle in the Levant. A donation in England could become horses, weapons, or sacks of grain for soldiers thousands of miles away. Even when no new crusading army left Europe for years, the Templar commanderies continued working quietly in the background, and that steady flow of money helped keep their eastern fortresses alive. But money was only half the story. The other half was privilege. And the Templars had one of the rarest privileges in medieval Europe: direct protection from the Pope. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull that placed the Templars under his direct authority. It exempted them from the control of local bishops. It allowed them to keep the spoils they captured in battle. And it gave the order a level of independence that made them unlike almost anyone else. A king could not command the Templars the way he commanded his own vassals. A bishop could not tax their property the way he might tax an ordinary church. The Templars had their own rules, their own property, their own chain of command, and that chain of command led past local rulers and straight to Rome. This made the order difficult to define. They were not simply the army of the King of Jerusalem. They were not just monks in a monastery. They were an international organization with its own soldiers, money, laws, and leadership, and they answered to one authority above all others, not the king they were fighting beside, but the Pope. For the Latin kingdoms, this was both a strength and a danger. The Templars were powerful enough to be necessary for survival, but they were not fully under the kingdom's control. By the late 12th century, the Templars were present in almost every layer of the crusading world: religion, war, finance, politics, pilgrimage, and frontier defense. All of these roles overlapped, and behind them was a financial system that could keep working even after defeats, losses, and disasters. That is why their reputation was not built only on battlefield discipline. It came from a much larger reality. Defeating a group of Templars in one battle did not mean defeating the order. Behind every loss, the system remained: another fortress, another commandery, another stream of money, another group of men ready to rebuild what had been destroyed. By the end of the 12th century, the Templars were no longer a small brotherhood of pilgrim guards. They had wealth, castles, military power, their own laws, and a network stretching from Europe to the Holy Land. But a system like that only became truly frightening when it stepped onto the battlefield. And on the battlefield, the Templars were often placed exactly where the danger was greatest. The Battle of Montgisar in 1177 was one of the moments when the Templars showed what they could do. By this point, Saladin had become the greatest threat to the Latin world in the region. If his army moved deep into the kingdom without being stopped, Jerusalem itself could face real danger. Baldwin IV, the young king of Jerusalem, led a Latin force that was far smaller than Saladin's army. He moved quickly, and he struck before Saladin could fully organize his forces into the best fighting position. The Templars were there. The victory at Montgisard belonged to the whole army of Jerusalem under Baldwin IV. Not to the Templars alone, but where they stood in the army tells us something important. In many major campaigns, the Templars were not placed in the safe center of the formation. They were often put in the vanguard during an attack, or in the rear guard during a retreat. These were two of the most dangerous positions on the battlefield. The vanguard hit the enemy first. The rear guard was the last line holding back pursuit. These positions were where pressure was highest, and where a weak unit could collapse quickly. The Templars were given these roles not because they were disposable, but because their discipline made them less likely to break. For a Muslim commander facing a Latin army, the sight of white mantles and red crosses at the front of the formation meant one thing: that point would be hard to crack. The order had come a long way from guarding pilgrims on the road. It had become a force trusted with positions that could decide the survival of an entire army. More than a century later, the Templars appeared at another critical point. This time not in a great victory, but at the end of an era. Acre, 1291. By then, Jerusalem had been lost for decades. The Latin territories in the Holy Land had been pushed back toward the coast, and Acre had become the last great port city of the crusader world on the mainland Levant. When the Mamluks, the Muslim dynasty ruling Egypt and Syria, attacked Acre, the military orders, including the Templars, stood in the city's final defenses. They fought through the last days of the siege, and when the walls were breached, the fighting did not simply stop. It spilled into the streets, into the remaining strongpoints, into the headquarters of the Templar order itself, where a group of Templars held out until the structure collapsed around them. Then Acre fell, and with it, major Latin power in the Holy Land came to an end. Montgisard shows the Templars in a period when the Latin kingdom could still counterattack. It shows how they were trusted in the most decisive positions on the field. Acre shows something else. It shows that even when the Crusader world was collapsing around them, the Templars were still there. At the final line, in the final fight. Now return to Hattin, 1187. After the battle, Saladin had a valuable list of prisoners. Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, was captured alive. Several Latin nobles were also captured alive. These were men who could be turned into money, exchanged for prisoners, or used in negotiations. But with the Templars, Saladin did not make that calculation. By 1187, the order had existed for almost 90 years. It had commanders, rules, castles across the Levant, property and networks in Europe. and decades of combat experience in the very land where the war was being fought. A ransomed Templar would return to the order. An exchange Templar would return to a fortress somewhere. A noble who was ransomed might never fight again, but a Templar who survived would go back to the place where he was most dangerous. Inside the order, inside a fortress, under the same discipline, connected to a network that still existed after Hattin. Saladin had just destroyed the main army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem was now open. In that moment, eliminating the elite warriors of the military orders was not just an act of revenge. It was a cold military decision. They were killed because, if allowed to live, they could return to the war. That decision says more about the Templars than any praise ever could. In Saladin's eyes, they were not just individual knights. They were members of an organization that could keep fighting even after the battle was over. A few months after Hattin, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. The city that the First Crusade had captured in 1099 now passed out of Latin hands. Hattin became the breaking point of the kingdom. The Templars began as unknown escorts on the road to Jerusalem, but almost a century later, they had become something far larger. They were fortresses standing over the roads that kept the kingdom alive. They were cavalry holding the vanguard when other units might break. They were money flowing from hundreds of commanderies in Europe, quietly feeding a war in the East that never truly ended. They were religious vows turned into military discipline, and that discipline became a weapon more frightening than numbers alone. So at Hattin, Saladin did not look at them as prisoners worth ransoming. He saw a system that could survive defeat, rebuild, regroup, and fight again. Others could be kept for negotiation. The Templars could not. And that moment shows how far they had come. From nameless guardians of pilgrims to one of the most feared military religious orders the age of the Crusades ever produced.